You cast your line, sit back in your chair, and wait for hours, totally confident that your bait is resting perfectly on the bottom. But what if I told you that your perfect presentation is actually a tangled, useless ball of garbage? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are breaking down a painful truth about that reliable grandpa rig you have been using for decades. I'm going to show you exactly why your favorite setup is secretly tangling underwater every single time you cast, completely destroying your chances of getting a bite. We are going to expose the real reason why you are sitting on the bank, catching nothing but a sunburn. Be honest, how many times have you reeled in a massive knot and blamed it on the retrieve? This topic is incredibly important because generation after generation of fishermen are making the exact same fatal mistake. We all grew up learning how to fish from our fathers and grandfathers. They taught us how to tie these classic, heavy-duty rigs, and we absorbed that knowledge like absolute gospel. Because we deeply respect the men who taught us, we rarely stop to question the mechanical physics of the gear itself. We just assume that if they caught a few fish with it 40 years ago, it must still be the perfect way to fish today. We blindly tie on the giant swivels, the thick, stiff lines, and the bulky plastic booms, completely ignoring the fact that modern fishing pressure and much smarter fish demand a far better approach. We do the exact same thing for years, repeatedly wondering why our catch rates are dropping, without ever realizing that the actual problem is tied directly to the end of our own line. Picture this in your mind right now. It is a beautiful Sunday morning, and the mist is still rolling off the surface of the lake. You have just arrived at your favorite spot. You unpack your gear, set up your comfortable chair, and grab your trusty fishing rod. You tie on that classic rig, the one your grandfather taught you how to make when you were just a kid. You bait the hook carefully, making sure it looks absolutely irresistible to any fish swimming by. You step up to the edge of the water, take a deep breath, and cast with all your might. The lead weight sails through the crisp morning air. It lands with a heavy, satisfying splash far out in the deep water. You quickly reel in the slack line, place the rod securely in the holder, and attach your bite alarm. You sit back with a hot cup of coffee. In your mind, that bait is sitting perfectly on the muddy bottom. You picture it spread out beautifully, just waiting for a massive fish to swim by and snatch it up. You feel totally confident. You feel like a seasoned pro who knows exactly what he is doing. But what if I told you that your imagination is playing tricks on you? What if that perfect picture in your head is a complete lie? What if right now, at the bottom of the lake, your bait is just a useless, tangled ball of wire and fishing line? Let us talk about why we trust this old setup in the first place. We trust it because we learned it from the men we looked up to. We remember going out on the boat 20 years ago and pulling in fish after fish using this exact same method. We think that if it worked in 1999, it absolutely has to work today. We rarely question the mechanics of the setup. We just blindly copy the old knots, the heavy metal swivels, and the incredibly thick monofilament line. But here is the harsh reality. Fishing pressure has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. The materials available to us have changed, and most importantly, the fish have become much smarter. We are stubbornly holding on to a piece of fishing history that is actually ruining our chances of catching anything today. We go to the store and spend hundreds of dollars on modern carbon fiber rods and incredibly smooth, expensive reels. Yet we get to the water and tie on a rig that belongs in a museum. We are constantly sabotaging our own trips out of pure nostalgia. It is time to look at this situation objectively. We need to stop letting our sentimentality get in the way of having a successful day on the water. So let us break down exactly what happens during the cast. Think about the physical mechanics when you swing that long rod forward. The heavy lead sinker is the driving force. It pulls the entire setup through the air with incredible speed. But what exactly is the bait doing during this flight? The bait is much lighter and bulkier than the lead. It immediately catches the wind resistance. Because of this drag, the bait starts to spin wildly around the main line, spinning just like a helicopter blade in a storm. Every single rotation brings that sharp hook closer and closer to your thick main line. By the time your rig is 50 feet out over the water, the leader has already wrapped itself tightly around the sinker or the main line multiple times. You cannot see any of this happening from the shoreline. All you can see is the heavy lead flying in a straight, beautiful arc towards your target. But the massive damage is already being done high up in mid-air. The aerodynamic disaster is unfolding right before your eyes, but it happens so incredibly fast that you have absolutely no idea. You are essentially casting a complicated, useless knot straight into the water. Now we reach the critical moment of impact. The rig finally hits the surface of the water. The heavy lead sinker immediately breaks the surface tension and plunges downward like a falling rock. But the bait, being lighter and having more surface area, hesitates on the surface for a split second. This tiny difference in sinking speed is the ultimate killer of the classic grandpa rig. As the heavy sinker falls rapidly towards the bottom, the slack leader line loops back over itself. The bait gets dragged down forcefully behind the sinker, twisting and turning violently in the underwater turbulence. The sheer water resistance pushes the bait directly into the main line as it descends. Any physical separation you thought you had between the hook and the lead weight is completely wiped out in the first 2 seconds of the sink. Your beautifully presented bait, the one you spent 5 minutes hooking perfectly, is now hugging the main line for dear life. It is spinning and tangling with every foot it drops. By the time it is halfway to the bottom, the situation is completely beyond saving. The trap has essentially sprung on itself long before a fish even knows it is there. But the disaster does not stop there. We also have to consider the underwater currents. When you look at a lake or a slow-moving river from the bank, the surface often looks perfectly calm and peaceful. It looks like a giant mirror reflecting the clouds. But underneath that calm surface, the water is constantly moving in different directions. There are hidden currents, thermal layers shifting, and underwater undertows that act like a washing machine. While your already tangled rig is sinking, these underwater currents catch the bulky bait and spin it even more. If you are fishing in 30 feet of water, that is a long journey for a tangled rig to endure. The current pushes against the thick monofilament line, creating a bowing effect in the water. The leader, which is supposed to float freely away from the main line, gets pushed right back into the danger zone. The water pressure forces the hook to snag onto the swivel or the sinker loop. What started as a minor tangle in the air has now become a permanent, tight knot under the water. The forces of nature are actively working against the stiff, outdated design of your rig, and you are sitting on the bank, completely oblivious to the chaos below. Finally, the heavy sinker hits the bottom of the lake. It crashes into the mud and silt, sending up a small cloud of murky debris. The sinker stops moving completely, but the bait, which is slightly more buoyant, continues to flutter down for 1 more second. Because the leader is already wrapped around the main line multiple times, the bait does not drift away gracefully. Instead, it collapses directly on top of the lead weight, right in the middle of that mud cloud. The tension on the line disappears for a brief moment, which allows the tightly wound twists to coil up on themselves, creating what fishermen call a massive bird nest. You have absolute zero presentation. The hook is buried in the stiff coils of the thick leader line. The bait is mashed aggressively against the cold metal of the sinker. There is no natural movement whatsoever. To any smart fish swimming by, this does not look like a struggling worm or a tasty piece of cut bait. It looks like a bizarre, unnatural lump of metal and wire resting in the dirt. You have officially deployed a trap that cannot catch anything, and the most tragic part of this entire scenario is that you did everything right according to the old rules, yet you still failed completely. So here you are, back on the shoreline. You have tightened your line just enough to put a slight bend in the rod tip. You settle back into your comfortable folding chair. You pour yourself another hot cup of coffee from the thermos. You look around at the beautiful scenery. The sun is shining brightly, the birds are singing in the trees, and you are feeling totally at peace with the world. You are fully prepared to sit there for 2 or 3 hours, patiently waiting for a giant fish to come along and bend that rod in half. You watch the tip of the rod like a hungry hawk, waiting for that telltale tap. But what you do not realize is that you are participating in a completely pointless waiting game. Your bait is dead in the water. It is a tangled, hidden mess that no self-respecting fish will ever touch. You could sit in that chair for 10 hours and nothing would change. You are essentially just soaking a piece of lead and some tangled string in the lake. It is a harsh reality to accept. We spend so much time planning our trips, buying the right snacks, waking up before the sun, and driving miles to the water. But we throw all that effort away because we blindly trust a rig that fails the moment it enters the water. To make matters even worse, the environment loves to play nasty tricks on us. The wind starts to pick up across the surface of the water. The underwater currents shift slightly throughout the morning. Because your bait is locked into a tight ball with the heavy main line, any movement in the water drags the entire messy rig across the bottom. This dragging motion sends small, sharp vibrations straight up the tight line and directly into your sensitive rod tip. You are sitting there staring at the rod, and suddenly you see a small bounce. Then another quick bounce. Your heart rate instantly shoots up. You jump out of your chair, spill your coffee in the grass, and hover your hand over the reel, ready to strike hard. You think to yourself, the fish are finally here. They are nibbling at the bait right now. But the sad truth is, there are no fish within 50 yards of your hook. Those vibrations are just the wind and the current dragging your tangled ball of trash over rocks and sticks on the lake bed. The stiff, old-school rig transmits these false signals perfectly. You are getting highly excited over absolutely nothing. The rig is not just failing to catch fish, it is actively lying to you and wasting your adrenaline. Eventually, you decide it is time to check the bait. You grab the rod, reel down the slack line, and pull back hard to set the hook, just in case something is silently hanging on there. You feel the heavy, dead resistance of the sinker dragging through the water. As you reel it in, you can feel that something is definitely not right. The rig feels heavy, clumsy, and unnatural. Finally, the setup breaks the surface of the water, and you see the absolute disaster hanging from your rod tip. The leader is wrapped tightly around the main line 10 times. The hook is securely caught on the heavy swivel. The bait is mashed and totally ruined. But here is the biggest lie we tell ourselves as fishermen. We look at that terrible mess and we confidently say, "Oh, it just tangled on the way back in." We convince ourselves that the rig was perfect on the bottom and that the spinning action of reeling it in caused the tangle. We refuse to accept that the rig was useless for the entire 2 hours it sat in the water. This convenient lie protects our ego. It allows us to tie the exact same terrible rig again, cast it back out, and repeat the same stupid mistake over and over. Let us take a much closer look at the actual hardware of this traditional setup. The classic grandpa rig is usually built with heavy-duty, oversized components. You have a massive brass swivel that looks strong enough to tow a small truck. You have heavy, thick monofilament line that has the rigid memory of a coiled metal spring. You might even have a wire spreader or a bulky plastic anti-tangle boom that does exactly the opposite of what its name implies. All of this extra hardware creates unnecessary weight, drag, and extreme stiffness. When you put a bulky bait on the end of a stiff piece of plastic and cast it, you are throwing an absolute aerodynamic nightmare. The heavy swivels act as dangerous pivot points where the line can easily loop over itself in flight. The thick monofilament leader refuses to lay flat and natural on the bottom. Instead, it coils up like an angry snake because it vividly remembers being wrapped around the plastic spool for 3 years. Every single piece of extra metal you add to your rig is just another trap for your leader to get caught on. The old-school thought process was that stronger and heavier meant better. But in reality, all that heavy hardware guarantees a terrible presentation. The type of bait you use also plays a massive role in this tangling disaster. Think about threading a large, juicy nightcrawler onto your hook, or maybe you are molding a big, heavy chunk of sticky dough bait around a treble hook. These baits are not perfectly streamlined, aerodynamic shapes. They are lumpy, uneven, and extremely bulky. When you forcefully launch this bulky bait into the sky, it catches the air like a tiny deployed parachute. The air resistance tries to aggressively slow the bait down, while the heavy lead sinker is pulling it forward at top speed. This extreme difference in directional forces causes the bait to spin violently out of control. Now, combine this wild, spinning action with a stiff, memory-filled leader line and a bunch of heavy metal swivels. It is a guaranteed recipe for absolute disaster. A lighter, more streamlined bait might survive the flight without spinning too much, but the big, heavy baits we love to use for bottom fishing are guaranteed to create a severe helicopter effect. You are demanding way too much from an outdated rig. You are asking a clumsy, stiff setup to handle highly unaerodynamic payloads, and the final result is always a tangled mess. We do not have to guess about any of this anymore. We live in an amazing time where modern technology gives us a literal window into the underwater world. Scuba divers and professional anglers have started dropping high-definition underwater cameras down to the bottom of heavily fished lakes and rivers. They place these cameras right next to their baited rigs and film exactly what happens during the cast, the fall, and the long wait. The footage they bring back is absolutely brutal to watch for any traditional fisherman. Time and time again, the clear videos show the classic heavy rigs crashing into the bottom in a completely tangled ball. The cameras reveal the harsh truth that the bait is almost never resting naturally away from the lead. It is always coiled up, hugging the main line, or wrapped tightly around the plastic booms. The underwater footage completely destroys the popular myth that the rig tangles on the retrieve. The cameras clearly show that the tangle happens instantly, the very moment the rig hits the water and sinks. Seeing this video footage for the first time is a massive wake-up call. It forces you to realize that you have probably wasted hundreds of hours of your life staring at a motionless rod. Now let us think about this entire situation from the perspective of the fish. Fish are certainly not stupid, especially the big, older fish that have survived for many years in heavily pressured public waters. They have seen every single trick in the book. A mature fish uses all of its highly tuned senses to hunt. It actively looks for natural movement. It looks for something that truly belongs in the aquatic environment. When a smart fish swims up to your bait, it does not just blindly swallow it without thinking. It inspects it closely. It swims in tight circles around it. It uses its sensitive lateral line to feel the microscopic vibrations. If your bait is wrapped in a tight ball of thick monofilament line, jammed up against a giant brass swivel and a heavy piece of unnatural lead, the fish is going to know immediately that something is completely wrong. It looks exactly like a piece of dangerous human garbage, not a free meal. The fish might bump it slightly with its nose, triggering one of those small false bites you see on the rod tip, but it will never open its mouth and fully commit to eating it. The fish will simply turn its tail and swim away to find real food. So why do we continually refuse to adapt our methods? Why do we suffer from this stubborn fisherman syndrome? It mostly comes down to pride and comfortable habit. We are creatures of extreme habit. When we get perfectly comfortable doing something a certain way, it takes a tremendous amount of effort to change our core mindset. We walk into the local tackle shop, see the pre-tied grandpa rigs hanging safely on the wall, and we buy them because they feel warmly familiar. We think to ourselves, well, they still sell them in the store, so they must work perfectly fine. We actively ignore the modern advancements in fishing theory because we are simply too proud to admit that our beloved old methods are deeply flawed. We deeply love to tell long stories about the massive fish we caught 20 years ago using these exact same rigs. But we conveniently forget to mention the countless empty days we spent sitting on the bank, catching absolutely nothing at all. We proudly wear our stubbornness like a shiny badge of honor, claiming that we prefer the old-school way of doing things. But at the end of the day, the fish do not care about your traditions or your pride. One of the biggest functional flaws in the traditional setup is the length and material of the leader itself. The classic rig usually features a very short, incredibly stiff piece of heavy monofilament line for the leader. Years ago, this was specifically designed to prevent tangles by keeping the bait pushed rigidly away from the main line. But in actual reality, this extreme stiffness is exactly what causes the primary problem. When a stiff leader is strongly forced to bend during the cast or the rapid sink, it acts exactly like a tightly coiled spring. It aggressively wants to snap back into its original straight shape. If it accidentally wraps around the main line just once, the stiffness of the material completely locks it into place permanently. Furthermore, a very short leader leaves the bait far too close to the heavy hardware. Even if by some incredible miracle it does not tangle, the bait is still presented mere inches from a giant piece of highly unnatural lead. Modern angling science has thoroughly proven that longer, softer, more supple leader materials are vastly superior in every single way. A soft leader absorbs the shock of the cast and flows beautifully and naturally in the water. Another major culprit in this tangled mess is the infamous loop knot, or the classic dropper loop. For many generations, everyday fishermen have tied a large loop in their main line, passed it simply through the eye of a hook, and proudly called it a day. It is very fast, it is very easy, and it is a classic grandpa technique that everyone knows. But from a strict mechanical standpoint, the dropper loop is a complete disaster waiting to happen. When you tie a large dropper loop in thick monofilament line, you are essentially creating a rigid right angle in the line itself. As soon as you cast and the heavy rig hits the water, the intense pressure of the current pushes directly against that loop. Because it is a doubled-up piece of thick line, it catches exactly twice as much water resistance. Under this underwater pressure, the loop simply collapses and spins rapidly around the main trunk line. The hook, which was supposed to be sticking out perfectly straight, is now glued tightly against the vertical line. Every time a fish nibbles lightly and lets go, the loop twists even further until it is a complete mess. The dropper loop is easily one of the least reliable ways to present a bait. If you still honestly do not believe that your absolute favorite setup is failing you, I highly challenge you to perform a very simple visual test. The next time you go to the lake, do not just cast your line out as far as you can into the deep, dark water. Instead, bait your hook exactly as you normally would on any given trip. Walk cautiously down to a shallow, highly clear area of the shoreline where the water is only about 2 feet deep. Stand back on the bank and execute a short, powerful cast parallel to the shoreline. Watch very closely as the rig flies quickly through the air, hits the surface, and rapidly sinks to the bottom. I guarantee you will be absolutely shocked by what you clearly see. You will watch your bait aggressively helicopter in the air. You will see the heavy lead drag the bait down in a chaotic, twisting spiral. And when you walk over and look straight down into the clear, shallow water, you will see your hook firmly wrapped around your main line. You will see firsthand that the presentation you thought was absolutely perfect is actually a miserable pile of tangled string. Seeing it directly with your own 2 eyes is the only way to truly break the illusion. So how do we practically fix this massive problem? The real answer is incredibly simple to execute. We must completely modernize the rig by stripping away all of the unnecessary metal garbage. We aggressively need to eliminate the giant brass swivels, the thick wire spreaders, and the stiff plastic booms that plague the tackle aisles. The absolute secret to a perfect bottom presentation is pure simplicity and aerodynamic balance. We need to transition quickly to streamlined setups like the modern running rig or the highly effective helicopter rig. These modern designs use very small, smooth components that specifically allow the heavy lead to fly first, while the bait naturally trails safely behind without spinning wildly out of control. We desperately need to swap out that thick, memory-filled monofilament for a much softer, highly supple braided line or a high-quality fluorocarbon leader. A softer leader effortlessly absorbs the sudden shock of the cast and flows wonderfully naturally in the water, settling gently over the bottom debris instead of coiling up like an angry snake. By greatly reducing the physical size of our hardware, we drastically reduce air resistance and tangles. Imagine the sheer feeling of executing a cast with a newly modernized, perfectly streamlined rig. You confidently step up to the edge of the water, take a deep breath, and smoothly swing the rod. The rig rapidly cuts through the air exactly like a fired bullet. There is absolutely no wild spinning. There is zero helicopter effect happening above the water. The heavy lead flies incredibly true, and the bait beautifully follows smoothly right behind it in a perfectly straight line. When it finally hits the water, the streamlined design instantly allows the lead to sink quickly, while the soft, highly supple leader gently carries the baited hook completely away from the danger zone. You proudly place the rod in the holder and sit back down in your comfortable chair. But this time, everything feels completely different. This time, you do not have a false, lying picture floating around in your head. You finally know with absolute certainty that your bait is resting beautifully on the bottom, completely untangled and perfectly presented. You confidently know that it looks completely natural to any passing fish. That heavy, nagging feeling of deep doubt is totally gone. When that sensitive rod tip finally bends violently in half and the drag on your reel starts screaming loudly, the overwhelming feeling of validation is absolutely incredible. You quickly grab the rod, firmly set the hook, and immediately feel the heavy, powerful head shakes of a massive fish fiercely fighting back. As you skillfully battle the giant fish all the way to the landing net, you deeply realize that this specific bite never would have happened with your old, permanently tangled setup. You joyfully realize that making a small, highly intelligent change to your tackle has completely transformed your overall success rate. You easily catch more fish, you waste significantly less time, and you finally stop lying to yourself about those fake tangles on the retrieve. You can absolutely still respect the wonderful traditions of your grandfather, but you truly honor his fishing legacy by evolving and becoming a much smarter, vastly better fisherman. You gladly leave the heavy, deeply outdated hardware resting safely in the tackle box where it strictly belongs, and you fully embrace the sleek, completely untangled efficiency of modern rigging. To sum it all up, the biggest turning point in your fishing journey is finally realizing that the "it just tangled on the retrieve" excuse is a complete lie we tell to protect our own ego. The ultimate plot twist is discovering that we actively sabotage our entire fishing trip in the first 2 seconds of the cast, all because we blindly trust an outdated rig. But now that you know the brutal underwater truth, you can completely change your approach. By stripping away the heavy metal, simplifying your hardware, and using softer leaders, you will instantly double your chances of actually catching a fish. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out today. If this video opened your eyes and helped you rethink your setup, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, smash that like button, and leave a comment below. I have one final question for you. Are you brave enough to admit your favorite rig is failing Or are you going to keep blaming the wind and the retrieve?